Let's pray, and then we'll jump in. God, thank you so much for this day that you've given us. I thank you once again for the weather and for the beautiful day that we got to enjoy. And I thank you for those who are here just to dive deeper into your word. We kind of say this week after week. I'm just grateful that we have folks here who are just taking your word and your story seriously. And we're just seeking to get to know more and more about you through the stories of your people. And so tonight, I pray that you'd bless us with just with your wisdom and with your guidance to know what to do with these stories. In Jesus' name, amen. So go ahead and turn to 1 Kings 2. And we'll be in 1 Kings 2, chapter 2, verse 30. You're welcome to come on in. You don't have to stop. Hold on. I have a sneeze. Excuse me. There it is. So turn to 1 Kings 2. We'll start at verse 13. And so, quick recap from what we did last week. So we covered the end of David's story and the beginning of Solomon's story last week. So 1 Kings starts off with a coup against King David. And it's from David's oldest living son. His name is Adonijah. He gets several powerful people on his side, but the aging David still has some influential voices on the other side in his ear. And so Nathan the prophet and Bathsheba, one of David's wives, they kind of go to bat for Bathsheba's son Solomon. And it's a little bit unclear when you read the story whether they remind him of a promise that he really made long ago, or whether they're kind of taking advantage of David in this kind of weakened state. And so they kind of whisper that he did make a promise, whether or not he did, we really don't know. But either way, David does, at that point, officially pronounce that Solomon will inherit the throne. So whether he really did or did not make this promise earlier, well, now in the text in 1 Kings, he definitely does. And so Solomon, at least then, is the rightful heir to the throne. And so then things, of course, go bad for Adonijah. And we leave, if you remember, we left on this kind of Godfather sort of scene. So I talked about the last scene of The Godfather last week. The movie ends with this kind of weird scene of baptism interspersed with this scene of mafia hits, right? And so this is kind of what David and Solomon are doing, or at least planning, as David is dying. And so at least in that moment, David looks no different than any other king or emperor or any other person in power at the time. Like, this is just part of the gig. This is just what happens when you kind of consolidate power and eliminate threats and things like that. So he doesn't look any different. Everybody else kind of does this. But as we talked about, the whole idea is that Israel should look different. Israel should be set apart just from those around them. And so, but David and Solomon, they kind of look like everyone else towards the end of David's life and the beginning of Solomon's reign. So tonight, we're going to continue with this whole Godfather scene. Don't worry, it's not rated R tonight, but we do see Solomon and David's plans come to fruition. And so I think we'll be maybe a little bit shorter tonight. So we will have some time for questions. You guys hardly ever have any questions, so go ahead and plan on it now. Write stuff down as we go through, and we'll have, I think we'll have a few extra minutes tonight as we end. Okay, so let's get started. Chapter 2, verse 13. It says this: Now Adonijah, son of Haggith, went to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother. So again, this is the contender for the throne, right? And he's going to Solomon's mother. So this is going to be kind of a tense little scene. Bathsheba asked him, "Do you come peacefully?" I think that's a really good question in this scenario. He answered, "Yes, peacefully." Then he added, "I have something to say to you." "You may say it," she replied. "As you know," he said, "the kingdom was mine." So he has this kind of built up in his head that like he had it, right? And then he says, "All Israel looked to me as their king, but things changed and the kingdom has gone to my brother, for it has come to him from the Lord. Now I have one request to make of you. Do not refuse me." "You may make it," she said. So again, this is like a very cautious sort of conversation that especially Bathsheba is having. Her responses are very short and kind of careful what she's saying. "You may make it," she said. So he continued, "Please ask King Solomon, he will not refuse you, to give me Abishag the Shunammite as my wife. So remember, Abishag was David's young and beautiful companion that he has as he lay dying at the end, or in the last chapter. Very well, Bathsheba replied, I will speak to the king for you. When Bathsheba went to Solomon to speak to him for Adonijah, the king stood up to meet her, bowed down to her, and sat down on his throne. He had a throne brought in for the king's mother, and she sat down at his right hand. So let's stop for a second. Let's talk about the idea of a queen mother here. This is kind of what we have with Bathsheba. So back in kind of ancient kingdoms and things like that, you really had kind of like three different depictions of women who were close to the throne or in some cases had the throne. So one kind of idea would simply be the king's wife, or maybe the king's primary wife if they had more than one. And in that case, the queen could be just simply the woman on his arm, or she could go as far as almost function like a king's deputy, where she has some significant influence on some of the decisions that are made for the kingdom. So here's not a positive example. You've got a much later king named Ahab. Allison is not allowed to answer this question because she ruined it this morning. Anybody know who Ahab's wife is? King Ahab's wife. Jezebel, right? Good. You guys are awesome. You told them, didn't you? What's that? Yeah, the first answer is Jezebel. Anyway, so the name, Allie, come on, man. The name carries with it a reputation, right? So you've heard the name Jezebel before, and women have been called Jezebel, whether fairly or unfairly. But the name has a reputation. And so as you might know from her name, she has a very strong, though not positive, influence on the kingdom under Ahab. So she's very strong influence with the king. Some people would say he's just not really a strong king at all, and she really kind of uses him like a puppet. So anyway, she has a strong influence, not a good influence, but that is simply a king's wife who had a strong influence in her position. So another type of queen would be like the wife or a mother who takes the throne when the king dies. And you don't see this very often. You see it a few times kind of in general history. We see it once in Israelite history. And the one time that we do see it in the Bible, she's not a good example either, right? So we have these two ladies, Jezebel and this other woman. They're both not good. Sorry, ladies, they're already not two good examples. So anyway, then you have the idea of like this queen mother sort of role. And so what she does is she takes the leadership role from her husband when he dies, and basically it's almost like you have a king rise up who was young. And so you have someone who has experience, and so the queen mother kind of reigns along with a young king and has a lot of influence, especially in the first few years. So this is really Solomon and Bathsheba's roles. You get the idea that Solomon probably is pretty young. Even the older contender to the throne, Adonijah, said that he would have been about 35 years old when Adonijah went for the throne. Solomon is still much younger than him. And so I don't know offhand exactly how old Solomon would be. But in the next chapter, we get the story where Solomon asked God for wisdom, and he specifically says how inexperienced he is. And so he wants God's wisdom. And so, again, you get the idea, Solomon's probably pretty young, and Bathsheba has a lot of experience, and so she comes along and kind of co-reigns with Solomon, especially has influence in his early years. And so that is the queen mother, and that's really the role that Bathsheba has. What's interesting is you can look at some of the histories, the kingdom histories that we have in Scripture. So you have the lists of the kings of Israel in Scripture. So in books like Kings and Chronicles, you have the list of the kings of Israel. And then Israel, the nation splits into just Israel and then Judah. And so there's a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And what's interesting is you don't really see the queen mother role very often in the history of Israel's kings, but almost every time they'll make reference to the king's mother in Judah's lists. And so I don't know exactly what to do with that, but one kingdom, this is a role that continues to have influence, and maybe it almost becomes tradition that the mother will help the next king. But in the other side of the kingdom, You just don't see it. So it's kind of interesting how it plays out. A kingdom splits. This becomes a big role for one and not the other. Okay, verse 20. I have one small request to make of you. So again, this is Bathsheba talking to Solomon. She said, do not refuse me. The king replied, make it, my mother, I will not refuse you. So she said, let Abishag the Shunammite be given in marriage to your brother Adonijah. King Solomon answered his mother, why do you request Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? You might as well request the kingdom for him. After all, he is my older brother. Yes, for him and for Abiathar, the priest, and Joab, the son of Zeruiah. So remember, Abiathar and Joab are co-conspirators along with Adonijah. So obviously, Solomon does not take this very well. He ends with this kind of sarcastic response, and he says, hey, why don't you just request the whole kingdom for him, right? And so this does not rub Solomon the right way. So what is Solomon's big deal with this? If you remember, Abishag was David's companion. Now David has died, so why does it matter to Solomon if she is given to Adonijah? So to understand this, we have to understand what the purpose behind multiple wives and concubines really was for these ancient kings. So something to keep in mind is that a king is not just magically protected just by nature of being on the throne, right? There's nothing magical about that. There's not some orb that just kind of is a shield for him. Like, he has to remain in favor with powerful people in his kingdom. Otherwise, he might expose himself to threats and conspiracies and that sort of thing. And so several times, for instance, like in Rome's history, the emperor's own personal bodyguard, they're called the Praetorian Guard, his personal bodyguard will turn against him, right? And so if the people who are paid to guard you personally, if they turn against you, well, then you're wide open to violence and assassination threats and things like that. And so you want to keep these important people around you. You want to keep them happy and stay in their trust. Otherwise, a king is just like every other human being. They can be killed, right? So if you remember this from last week, the king has to remain in favor with certain factions of powerful people. So this is why Adonijah, as he starts contending for the throne, he enlists the support of powerful people, right? So a king who's in power also needs that support. But in some cases, it wasn't just the political elite. Sometimes there might be powerful clans, powerful families that the king may also want in his pocket. So yes, you've got the politicians. Yes, you've got the military commanders. Yes, you might have the priesthood, but also you may see, here's a really, really powerful family, and here's a really powerful clan, and I want them kind of in my pocket as well. And so here's the point. Taking on a wife or a concubine from a particular region or a particular clan is essentially kind of an alliance in human form, right? So you have taken that person from that clan into your household, and what it does is it kind of shows that you are now allied with who their family is and their clan and things like that. If you've studied some European history, you kind of see the same thing. So people who secure support and alliances through marriage, right? So in some cases you have somebody who's a royal figure like in England, and they marry someone from Spain. And so now you have this kind of alliance that's there back in European history. So my favorite example of this is a family called, a family called the Habsburg family. So the Habsburgs are a powerful dynasty in European history, and they still exist even today. So you see, you've got these kind of very old, ancient sort of depictions, and then you have just a regular photo of some regular dude even now. So the Habsburgs still exist, and they've been kind of in power in different ways in Europe through about 500 years. And so part of their strategy for gaining power was to do it intentionally through marrying the right people. And so they would kind of arrange these strategic marriages based on the alliances that they desired. And it worked, and the family is still powerful like 500 and 600 years later. So in fact, about 500 years ago, a particular quote became associated with the Habsburg family to say this: let others wage war, but thou, O happy Austria, where they're from, you all marry, right? Everybody else can fight over stuff, but you're going to gain power by marriage. And it says, for those kingdoms which Mars, the god of war, gives to others, Venus, the god of love, gives to you, right? So everybody else can wage war and they can fight and all that stuff, but here's what we're going to do. Our strategy is going to be strategic marriage. And it works for them. Somebody said that this is kind of the first iteration of the quote, make love, not war, right? This is kind of what we're looking at with the Habsburg family. So they have taken this marriage strategy very, very seriously. I think it's just kind of a funny example. And again, you have a guy today who's even still in power and a product of that. So, but back in Israel, we tend to think of multiple wives and concubines, and we tend to think of that from a negative, like moral standpoint today, right? This doesn't really sit well with us. We don't really know what to do with this. And so now, today, we see it as sexual indulgence, or we might see it as the subjugation of women, things like that. And so what's really happening, though, when we think of it that way, is we're placing our modern morality standards back on this ancient practice, because they would not have seen it that way, right? And I'm not excusing it, of course, but they would not have seen it as indulgence and things like that. They would have seen it very, very differently. So what a harem, and a harem, in case you don't know, harem is kind of the living quarters of the wives and concubines in a kingdom. And so it kind of begins, it's associated with like, okay, here's the group of women that you have. So what a harem really represented for them was really a reflection of the political alliances that they have made throughout their reign. And so these are symbols of power and influence and alliance. And so really, the larger the harem was, the more power you had. One, because bigger is always better, right? But two, because each woman there represents an alliance that you have struck strategically, right? So does that kind of make sense? We look at a harem this way. We think, oh, it's so bad and women are subjugated. That's all true. But they look at a harem like, okay, this is my political strategy kind of in person form. Does that make sense? Okay, so when a king died, typically a harem, as well as any other alliances, they would be passed down to his heir. And so all of David's harem is now Solomon's, as well as anything that he gains. And actually, it specifically talks about David inheriting King Saul's harem as well. So that's the king before David. And so, so you get an idea. Also, by the way, when a king is deposed, the contender to the throne, the guy who's victorious, even if it was a fight, then they also inherit the harem as well. So all that to say, we're starting to get a picture of why Adonijah's request to Solomon for Abishag is kind of offensive, right? So if you were to picture like a corporate succession, and the son of a former CEO, he loses the board vote to his brother, right? So CEO is on his way out. He has two sons contending for the position. One son loses to the other son. And so the guy who lost, he says, well, can I at least have dad's private office and his executive assistant, right? You're like, no, because then people will think you're in charge, right? So this is kind of what's happening. This is why Adonijah's request for Abishag does not sit well with Solomon. So again, even Solomon's sarcastically like, hey, why don't you just give him the whole kingdom, right? You're going to take one woman away from this harem, just give him the whole thing, because that's kind of as offensive as this is for me. Verse 23, does that kind of make sense? I read these things and I'm trying to anticipate questions, because this is a question that I had, right? I'm looking at that and I was like, why does he care about this companion of David's? And so I kind of dug into it and hope that was helpful for you all as well. Verse 23, then King Solomon swore by the Lord, may God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if Adonijah does not pay with his life for this request. So this is an oath that we have seen before. May the Lord deal with me, may God deal with me, be it ever so severely. Do you remember seeing this before? Anybody? So it was in Ruth, right? I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it, but I was just going to see if anybody picked it up on it. So this was back in Ruth, and I pointed out then that this is actually something that you see a few times, this oath formula. So back in Ruth chapter 1, Ruth swears her loyalty to Naomi in this really, really profound way. It's a beautiful part of the book. And Ruth says this, it says, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I'll be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." So, we've seen this oath before, and in fact, you'll see it a few times throughout the books, specifically of Ruth and Samuel and Kings. So let me take a little bit of a bunny trail. Let's kind of depart tonight's text just for a minute, and I want to share with you, I think this is a good place to share some of the things that come into play when scholars try to date different ancient books. So we talked about this on the first week. It's sometimes hard to date the New Testament books. It's real hard to date the Old Testament books, just simply because they're much older. And so one of the things that they look for is things like consistent usage of language. So you have a phrase here, "May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely," kind of a little packaged phrase just like that you begin to see in several different places. Now, some people think they would take the position that Ruth is actually written, and we talked about this, Ruth could have been written during the reign of King David. It has a lot to do with David's descendants and really how David comes to be. And so you're thinking David is at the height of his power, and we want to tell a background story about David. And so maybe Ruth was written then. And then people would think that Samuel and Kings are written much later. Kings, for instance, has to be written later because Kings includes the exile that happens far in the future. And so it has to be written at least after the exile. So you have Ruth at this point in history, and then people think probably 500 or 600 years later, Samuel and Kings might be written. So others may look at this sort of language usage here, and they may say, well, there's no way there's 500 years between these books. They're using the same slang, if you will. They're using the same kind of idiom, if you will. So this was a dumb example I used this morning. If you have something that was written in 2026 and it has the phrase 6-7 in it, right? And you have two things that are written, well, one of those could be written in 2026, but you would know that another version of that was not written in 1970, right? It's written in 2025, 26 as well, right? And so you have these things that are mentioned here and these unique phrases and language. And so it kind of has a counterpoint to the idea that Ruth is written this time and then 500 years later these other books are written this time. They use the same thing, and so it makes you think maybe these are much closer in time when they were written. So I really don't know what the answer is, but in case you're curious, this is some of the stuff that goes into trying to figure out when a book was written, especially the Old Testament. There's a lot of different things that are there. And so it could be possible that Ruth as a story may have been passed around orally from the time of King David and then gets put to paper along with things like Samuel and Kings, and you have the same sort of phrases and turns of phrase at that time together. So does that kind of make sense? Okay, just kind of it was a place where we could talk about that. Again, it's a bit of a departure from tonight's lesson, but just kind of an if you're curious sort of thing. So verse 23, we'll get back to it. King Solomon swore by the Lord, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if Adonijah does not pay with his life for this request. And now, as surely as the Lord lives, he who has established me securely on the throne of my father David and has founded a dynasty for me as he promised, Adonijah shall be put to death today." So King Solomon gave orders to Benaiah, you'll see that name several times tonight, Benaiah son of Jehoiada, and he struck down Adonijah and he died. So to be perfectly honest, it seems that Abishag may not have been a part of the king's harem. So we just talked all about the king's harem, right? I made the case that this is why it's so offensive. However, remember, it specifically says that David did not sleep with her. And so Abishag was not David's wife, was not David's concubine, it was David's companion. But I think we can safely say she is close enough to that sort of role for this to have been kind of in bad taste for Adonijah to ask for. So the guy who barely escapes Solomon's mercy has clearly not learned his lesson here and Solomon just kind of takes care of them altogether. So, verse 26. To Abiathar the priest, so remember that's a co-conspirator with Adonijah. To Abiathar the priest, the king said, "Go back to your fields in Anathoth. You deserve to die, but I will not put you to death now, because you carried the ark of the sovereign Lord before my father David and shared all my father's hardships." So Solomon removed Abiathar from the priesthood of the Lord, fulfilling the word the Lord had spoken at Shiloh about the house of Eli. We'll come back to that. But so you have the story of Abiathar now, and he is kind of banished to life outside the city. It seems like Solomon may have a little bit of trouble actually killing a priest, right? Maybe we all understand that, you know. And so especially a priest who had shared significant moments with David. So he carried the Ark of the Covenant. He was with David in his hardships, things like that. And so Solomon kind of backs off a little bit with Abiathar, but he does exile him. In 27, it specifically says this fulfills a prophecy regarding the house of Eli. So way back at the beginning of the story, we talked about this last week when we talked about kind of the background information here. We talked about how the whole idea of Israel's kingdom begins with Israel asking their last judge Samuel for a king. Do you remember that? So Israel asked Samuel for a king, and that's how this whole thing starts. Well, Samuel has been raised by a priest named Eli. Eli is not his father, but Samuel was raised by Eli. Now, Eli has real biological sons, and they took advantage of their position in the priesthood. So back then, the priesthood was kind of passed down through families, much like a kingship would have been passed down through families. And so if you were a priest, that position went with your particular family. And so his sons inherit the priesthood, and they really take advantage of that position. And so then there's this prophecy that one day God will take the priesthood away from Eli's family, or the house of Eli, right? And so Abiathar would have been Eli's great-great-grandson. He is exiled from Jerusalem. He is removed from the priesthood, and therefore this is the end of Eli's family in the priesthood. Does that make sense? So that's what that prophecy is referring to. Verse 28. When the news reached Joab, who had conspired with Adonijah, though not with Absalom, remember Absalom was the older son that David had, who also conspired against him. Joab fled to the tent of the Lord and took hold of the horns of the altar. So remember, this is what Adonijah had done last week, right? He goes to the tent of the Lord, takes hold of the altar. This is based on the tradition that the horns of the altar were where the sins were atoned for. And so they have this idea that you can go to the altar, you can go to the sanctuary, grab the altar, and basically kind of plead for a pardon in the sanctuary. But God had made allowances, at least in the law, he had made allowances for people in the case of an accidental killing, right? And I'm not sure if this was like a big problem back then, who knows, but that's what's in the law. However, as we talked about this last week, what Joab has done and what Adonijah has done cannot be considered accidental at all. It was totally intentional, totally on purpose. And so I'm not sure why they think the horns of the altar are going to benefit them. King Solomon was told that Joab had fled to the tent of the Lord and was beside the altar. Then Solomon ordered Benaiah, as that same name again, son of Jehoiada, go strike him down. So Benaiah entered the tent of the Lord and said to Joab, the king says, come out. So this is interesting. Solomon says, go and kill him, but Benaiah stops and he's like, I'm going to need you to come outside first, right? I'm not going to kill you in the sanctuary. And he stops. He's like, so again, there's a little bit of heartburn about doing things to a priest or doing things in the sanctuary. I think we can all understand that even today. But Joab answered, no, I will die here. And in my head, I'm thinking of like a toddler who clings to a parent's legs when they don't want to go somewhere, right? Or in preschool, you know, like they just don't want to go. And so this is Joab. He's like, nope, I'll do it now, do it here. And so Benaiah reported to the king, this is how Joab answered me. Then the king commanded Benaiah, do as he says, strike him down and bury him, and so clear me and my whole family of the guilt of the innocent blood that Joab has shed. So again, Solomon and David before him, they take what Joab has done very, very personally. And so it wasn't done to them, but it was essentially done to men under David's protection. So Joab has killed people kind of unlawfully, And so since they're under David's protection, it's almost like that offense was directly to and personal to David and now Solomon. So we kind of talked about these two stories last week, but Joab much earlier had killed these two men. And so, and also since Joab is in David's service, and he's really acting in a lot of ways on behalf of David as a military commander, it's almost as if Solomon is saying that Joab has made David's family guilty of these things as well, right? Joab is in so many ways functioning on David's behalf as military commander. And so when he does these things, he has made David's family guilty of these things. And so justice would say that Joab should die to pay for what he's done, but also it looks like he needs to die so that David's family is absolved of the guilt that has been brought on them through his actions. So think of it like your 16-year-old driver hitting a neighbor's mailbox, right? So obviously it's their fault, but that responsibility is probably going to fall on you as a parent when that happens. And so if it needs to be fixed, it's going to come to you. Now, if you're a good parent, you're going to make sure your child, pays for that somehow and works that off. But ultimately, it's going to be on you to make sure that that happens. So this is kind of what they're saying. Verse 32. The Lord will repay him for the blood he shed, because without my father David knowing it, he attacked two men and killed them with the sword, both of them, Abner son of Ner, commander of Israel's army, and Amasa son of Jether, commander of Judah's army, were better men and more upright than he. Shots fired right there. May the guilt of their blood rest on the head of Joab and his descendants forever. But on David and his descendants, his house and his throne, may there be the Lord's peace forever. So Benaiah son of Jehoiada went up and struck down Joab and killed him. And he was buried at his home out in the country. The king put Benaiah son of Jehoiada over the army in Joab's position and replaced Abiathar with Zadok the priest. So then the king sent for Shimei. Now at this point, we're just kind of going down the hit list of what's kind of been talked about in the previous chapter. So we have what David and Solomon have talked about as David was dying. And then also there's the more recent person who's made a bid for the throne. So Adonijah was actually not on David's list. So if you remember from the scene that we had at the end of last week, it talks about Shimei, it talks about Joab. Adonijah is not on that list. And so Solomon kind of takes that personally, and Solomon adds Adonijah to that list. Because, and we see this if you look closely in the stories about David, David's kind of a bit of a softie when it comes to being a dad. So it talked about Adonijah, and the reason he does the things that he does is because basically no one's ever told him no before in his life, right? Remember that part of last week's section? Earlier, so we have the story of Absalom as the older son. Absalom takes revenge on his half-brother who rapes Absalom's full sister. So Absalom kills him. Absalom flees. He goes away. And all David can do is just weep and want Absalom to come home, right? We know that two wrongs don't make a right, and so there probably needs to be some action against Absalom, but David is like, no, I just want him home, right? And so, again, David's kind of this big softy when it comes to his sons. And so Adonijah's not on David's hit list, but he is on Solomon's hit list. And so we have all the co-conspirators, and then now we have Shimei, who was on the list. Does anybody remember from last week what Shimei did? We talked about this last week. Does anybody remember just the broad strokes of that story? What did Shimei do? He did, yeah. He called down curses on him. So, real quick review. David's son Absalom had conspired against him. Another part of his story. David and his men have to leave Jerusalem because of this conspiracy against him. So they come across Shimei, who is cursing and throwing stuff at them, saying this is all because of David conspiring against King Saul several years before that. And so he's kind of getting what he deserves. And David shows him mercy. And we were like, yes, David, great job. Be the bigger man, David shows him mercy. Then on their return journey, they come across Shimei again. And his tune has changed. And he asks for forgiveness. And here's what's interesting. So in the original telling of the story, this happens in 2 Samuel, so this is before Kings, and the original telling of that story, David swears to Shimei, and this is a quote, he says, "You shall not die." This is what he says. He swears to Shimei, "You shall not die." But what's interesting is that David retells this story to Solomon, and he kind of edits history a little bit. And he says, actually, what he said was, I will not put you to death by the sword, right? So what he said originally was, you shall not die. That gets edited to, I won't be the one who does it, right? Which then exposes, leaves Shimei open to somebody else doing that work. And so that's the story of Shimei. So verse 36. Then the king sent for Shimei and said to him, build yourself a house in Jerusalem and live there, but do not go anywhere else. The day you leave and cross the Kidron Valley, you can be sure that you will die. Your blood will be on your own head. What's Solomon doing here with Shimei? Build your house in Jerusalem, don't leave. What's he doing? He's on house arrest, right? Solomon wants to keep him close, right? And so we learned from the earlier story about Shimei that Shimei is from the tribe of Benjamin. So I have a couple of maps up here. The one on the left is really just kind of the whole of Israel and the way the tribes are divided. And then zoomed in, you see the tribe of Benjamin and you see Jerusalem there labeled. And so Shimei is from the tribe of Benjamin, but Jerusalem, being their capital city, is really kind of a neutral zone. So think of it like D.C., right? D.C. is in District of Columbia. It's not a state. It's not Virginia. It's not Maryland, right? And so this is kind of what Jerusalem is in the middle of the tribe of Benjamin. And so what you see there is Shimei would not have to go very far in order to drum up support from his tribe. So if Shimei, if he happened to get a little anxious about his situation, or if he happened to want to turn on Solomon and get support from his own tribe, he just has to leave the city of Jerusalem to do it. They're surrounded by him. And so Solomon says, hey, build a house in the city. Don't even think about leaving. And if you cross the Kidron Valley, you're going to die. So the Kidron Valley, here's a close-up of Jerusalem. And the Kidron Valley is kind of the green mark that goes vertically about in the middle of that picture. That's the Kidron Valley. And so basically it is that little landmark just outside the city. If you leave and you cross that, that's it for you, man. So he can't leave the city. Verse 38. Shimei answered the king, what you say is good. Well, of course it's good. That's your only option. Shimei said, your servant will do as my lord the king has said. And Shimei stayed in Jerusalem for a long time. But 3 years later, 2 of Shimei's slaves ran off to Achish, son of Maacah, king of Gath. And Shimei was told, your slaves are in Gath. At this, he saddled his donkey and went to Achish at Gath in search of his slaves. So Shimei went away and brought the slaves back from Gath. So let's go back to that first picture. So you see Jerusalem marked with a pink arrow and Gath marked with a pink arrow. Has Shimei left Jerusalem? Oh yeah, he has, right? He's gone through other tribes and everything else. And actually Gath, if you can see on the other map here, actually I think I have like a little pointer that I can use. Can you see that, this little pointer here? Yes? So Gath is right there, and that's actually outside of Israel altogether. This is in the land of the Philistines. So it's probably hard to read from where you're at, but Gath is a city in Philistia. And so not only has Shimei left Israel, or Shimei has left Jerusalem, he's also left Israel altogether. And so that's how far away he's gone. Verse 41. When Solomon was told that Shimei had gone from Jerusalem to Gath and had returned, the king summoned Shimei and said to him, did I not make you swear by the Lord and warn you on the day you leave to go anywhere else, you can be sure that you will die? At that time you said to me, so he's reminding him, what you say is good, I will obey. Why then did you not keep your oath to the Lord and obey the command I gave you? The king also said to Shimei, you know in your heart all the wrong you did to my father David. Now the Lord will repay you for your wrongdoing. But King Solomon will be blessed, and David's throne will remain secure before the Lord forever. Then the king gave the order to his hitman, yes, Benaiah, his hitman, son of Jehoiada, and he went out and struck Shimei down, and he died. The kingdom was now established in Solomon's hands. So, why is the kingdom now established in Solomon's hands? He
fulfilled everything his father asked.
He did, right? But he took the throne, and he has fulfilled these things. But what are these things really? Why does this now establish the kingdom in his hands? It's payback. It is. Yes, both of you. Yes. he has gotten rid of threats. So make no mistake. I mean, these are, like what Brenda was saying, he's kind of avenging these wrongs that have been done, but these are also pretty calculated hits, right? And so remember, again, you remember that Godfather scene. So Michael Corleone is taking out all of the people, all of the other, the 5 families of the mafia. Like, he's taking out all the other heads of the families. And so not because, maybe because they've done him wrong, but also, more importantly, because they are threats to him. So this is what Solomon is doing. These are calculated hits. And so we are just kind of going down the list that David and Solomon had already talked about. And then adding to that list, for Solomon, Adonijah himself, because that was the contender. So, threats are disposed of. Adonijah for obvious reasons. Abiathar, the priest, he's not murdered, but he's exiled for the support of Adonijah. Joab is killed, I think, mostly for his support of Adonijah, but we're going to go ahead and throw in those other murders that he did a long time ago just for good measure, right? So we're just going to make sure that's going to be our reasoning. Then you have Shimei. And again, Shimei is a little bit hard to justify because, again, you go back to that story, and yes, he called down curses on David, but then David forgave him and let him go, and then actually he comes back asking for forgiveness, right? And so you think okay, maybe this Shimei story is wrapped up and it's nice and the right thing has happened, but we go on and we know that David actually hasn't forgotten, and Solomon's going to go ahead and do something about it. So what's happening with Shimei, right? It's a story that apparently is not wrapped up and has to be dealt with. So Shimei, he was loyal to Saul. It says him and Saul are both from the tribe of Benjamin. And so again, that's where you see him right there. But it also says that Shimei and Saul are from the same clan. So this is probably closer related than just tribe. So they are the same clan. We don't know what clan it was, but it does say they are from the same clan. So they're from the same tribe, Benjamin, and then further on in, zoomed in, they're from the same clan. And so, to read between the lines a little bit, it seems like whether it was legitimate fear or whether it was David and Solomon's paranoia, it seems like there's a fear regarding some sympathizers of Saul that maybe have remained. So again, Saul, king before David. So this would have been a long time ago because David's king for a long time. But there's maybe some people from his original tribe that still have this favor and support of what Saul used to be, right? And so there may be some sympathizers there. And so Shimei is confined to Jerusalem. He can't go into Benjamin territories or anywhere further. And then when he does, that's strike 1, 2, and 3 right there. So as we wrap up chapter 2, the contender to the throne is taken out. The conspirators are taken out. Any remaining support for King Saul's family and house is dealt with. And so the kingdom is firmly established in Solomon's hands. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's where we're going to wrap up today. But you know this, I always want to kind of talk about, okay, so what does this mean for us? What can we do with our lives now about what we have learned in this Bible story? And so we've been stuck with the aftermath of, what's that? So we've had the aftermath of all the mafia hits in the story, right? So we ended by talking about Solomon and David's plots last week, and then we haven't really moved a whole lot further. We've just kind of seen them be carried out. But the last line after the plots and the last line after the actual killings has kind of stuck with me both times. So if you remember from last week, the last line after David and Solomon were talking was this. This is verse 12. So Solomon sat on the throne of his father, David, and his rule was firmly established. So that was our last line last week. Last line today, something similar. The kingdom was now established in Solomon's hands. And so I look at both of these lines, and I think what troubles me is the author of Kings, it's their position that this is just kind of what had to happen, right? And we have talked about this already. This really is what was done back then to secure your rule. And so the first verse, you see it starts with the word so, right? Which means because all of the stuff before had happened, now it is firmly established. The second verse includes the word now in the middle of it, which means now that these things have happened, the kingdom is established. And so maybe maybe I'm just being naive and I'm not really considering what it really meant to be a ruler back then, to be aware of all of the powers and influences working against you. So maybe it's just the way it was, and I want King David and King Solomon to be different, and I'm just being naive about that. So I can't fix David and Solomon, but I can ask a question of us today. So we talked last week about how we are different, we are set apart, so it bothers me that they're not different and they're not set apart in this final chapter, but we are. And so let me zoom in a little bit further and talk about what do we do specifically with leadership and with power. I'm looking around at a lot of people who are leaders, whether it's in whatever circles they're in the church, in their jobs, things like that in the community. I'm looking at several leaders here in the room. And so, what are the things that we do when we want to establish power in our hands, right? What are the things that we do when we want to establish power in our hands? Now, I don't think anybody here is actually royalty, maybe, who knows, but we do have spheres of influence, right? You may not be a king or a queen, but we have spheres of influence. We have people who in some scenarios, we have power over them. And so how do we establish that? How do we secure that? Hopefully it's not through murder, but how do we get ahead? So for instance, do we exert power and influence over our friends by always being the person who has the gossip, right? Always being the person who's in the know. And people want to come to you because you've always got the scuttle about what's really going on. Is that how we have power and influence in social circles? Or do we have influence online by always trashing political parties and political decisions and political leader? Like, is that how we gain an audience and have a voice online? Or do we rise to power or leadership or influence or whatever at the expense of someone else? Do we rise to popularity at the expense of someone else, right? So I think the stories here about David and Solomon, they force us to ask some gut level questions about who we are when it comes to having power and having influence, right? How do we establish it? How did we get there? Do we do it like everybody else does it, you know? Or do we live quiet lives of conviction? Do we live quiet lives of conviction and then let that example be seen and taken for the influence that it hopefully is for people? So one of the most poignant prophecies about Jesus, it says this. It says, "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious." And it could stop right there, and that would be what they would want from every other king in history. He comes to you, righteous and victorious. But then it goes on and it says, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Or later, Paul writes about Jesus, and he says this. He says, Jesus, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, right? And so I think some of us, if we had what Jesus had and has equality with God, well, I'm grateful that we don't have that because we would use that to our own advantage, right? I would not be a very good steward of power like that. But what Jesus does is he makes himself nothing, takes the nature of a servant. And so what's significant about Jesus is he gains influence in a lot of ways by letting others speak for him, right? In some places, he even says, hey, don't tell people what I've done. Right? Don't tell people what I've done. And so he lets others. So there's stories about Jesus where he goes and he teaches in a synagogue, right? Or he does these amazing things. And the quotes from people are something like, oh my gosh, this guy teaches with power and authority. We've never seen someone like this who teaches with authority, right? And so he lets other people talk about the authority that he has. So if you're in a room and you have to tell everybody that you're in charge, you're not in charge, right? If it has to come from your mouth, you're not the one in charge. Right? Sometimes this might happen in preschool. If you have to be in the room with a bunch of kids and you got to be like, I'm in charge here. Well, that's probably the moment that you've lost control of the room, right? And so, anyway, so do we throw our weight around? Do we step on others on our rise to the top? Or do we live that life of humble conviction? and then let Jesus put us in whatever situation of influence that he wants to put us in. So 2 questions for us tonight before we go. What do we do when we're the most powerful person in the room? So let me stop there. There are times in your life, there are times in your job, there are times with your friends that you are the most powerful person in the room. So I use this example this morning. Who every now and then takes a role in teaching a Sunday school class here? Allison does. Nancy does. You do, Marilyn, don't you? You used to. Marilyn used to. She knows what it's like. Teaching a class here. Miranda is our administrative council chair, administrative board chair. Don't say that. Nathan has ministries with people who are in hospitals that he goes and visits. So in all these situations, you walk into a room, you're the most powerful person in the room. Teaching a class and people are looking at you, right? Being in charge of a board, going and ministering to people. What do you do when you are the most powerful person in the room? Second question, what do we do, or what did we do to get there? What did our path look like to get to the... Miranda's laughing. Miranda was just told to do it. What did we do to get to that position, right? And so I think it's a gut question for us to say, here I am, I have power and influence. What am I going to do with it? But also to reflect, how did I get here? Did I step on other people on the way to the top? Or did I let Jesus kind of place me where he wanted to be? And so what do you do when you're there? One thing that I have seen this week, I'm going to embarrass her. Heather is an amazing preschool director. Yeah. And so Heather is the most powerful person in the room, or maybe in the hallway at BKK. And the one thing that I have seen her do, especially this week, is to go to bat for those that she serves, to go to bat for those she's in charge of, and to step in and protect her teachers, the people that she's in charge of, right? And so she has authority over them, but with that authority, she's not going to throw her weight around. She's not going to make decisions just straight down from the top. She's going to step in and she's going to serve them, right? This is what I know that you all do as well, but just to encourage you, this is what a real leader does. If you have to say you're in charge, you're not in charge. If you have to throw your weight around, you have some sort of insecurity in your leadership. And so what a leader does is they serve, and they don't get there by stepping on other people. All right? A couple of questions for us to reflect on. We don't have as much time as I thought we did. We have 4 minutes for any questions that you might have.